Hey, it's Mitchell from Cherry Audio, and today I'm going to talk about the Polymode module, which emulates the famous and infamous Moog Polymoog synthesizer of the 70s. One of the world's very first polyphonic synthesizers, it excels at large pads and vocally sounds and big block chords, and its unique multiple filter implementation and its mod routings give it a sound like no other synth. It's probably best known for its use in Gary Numan's hit Cars, and let's get this right out of the way, it absolutely nails the Vox Humana sound. Now, in addition to Gary Numan, a lot of other great artists from the 70s used the Polymoog as well, including the Electric Light Orchestra, Kraftwerk, and Blondie. Original Polymoogs have a bad reputation for being pretty unreliable and kind of hard to use, but through the miracle of Voltage Modular and modern computers, we've sidestepped all of that. So we vastly improved the user interface on Polymode over the original Polymoog to make it much easier to use, much easier to understand, and a lot more fun to use. We also added a ton of CV control, which makes it much more flexible. The original Polymoog worked a lot like a string synthesizer or transistor organ from that era. The pitches of two fixed high-frequency square-wave oscillators were electronically divided to create the pitches for all 71 notes. Now, divide-down oscillators were popular in instruments of the 60s and 70s because it's a relatively easy thing to do in electronics, and it was really the only method of achieving polyphony that was feasible. But the problem is it's only capable of creating pure square waves. So to get around this, the Polymoog contained a small circuit board called a polycard under each key, and each one of these had a custom IC chip called a Polycom chip. And that chip converted the square wave to a ramp wave, and it also allowed the square wave pulse width to be adjusted and modulated, so that would give you the pulse width modulation sound that we're all pretty familiar with. Now, the Voltage Polymode module doesn't use the top-down divide architecture because it would be pretty heavy on computer CPU, but we went to great lengths to model the slightly filtered and wonky oscillator waves with great precision, and we also emulated the Polymoog's unusual voice architecture, which looks like this. It starts with two polyphonic oscillator ranks. These are routed to a mixer that lets you balance the rank levels, and following this is the voltage-controlled amplifier, which controls volume contour via the amplitude envelope generator. Now, there's an individual amplitude envelope generator for every single key on the poly cards that we talked about before, which is pretty neat. That means you've got individual volume envelope articulation for every single key. The output of the VCA then gets multed out to the three filters, which are the Resonators, mode filters, and the voltage-controlled filtered, with the voltage-controlled filtered cutoff frequency controlled by the VCF envelope generator. From there, the Resonators, mode filters, and VCF, along with the unfiltered direct signal, get mixed in the master gain section, which is basically a mixer, and the output of this mixer then goes to the mix output jack. If you're familiar with analog synths, it should be evident that this is a somewhat unusual voice architecture. A typical analog synth is oscillator, filter, amplifier, whereas in the Polymoog, it's oscillator, amplifier, filters, plural, along with the unfiltered signal mixed in there. And you'll see this mixed combination of direct and multiply filtered signals really excels at formant-type sounds and vocal pads and phaser-y type sounding things. It's really quite unusual and unique and fabulous for huge block poly kind of sounds. So without further ado, let's dive into the Polymode module. So here's the Polymode module, and the first thing we're going to talk about is the control input section over here. Now, typically the first thing you'd want to do with an oscillator or full instrument module would be to hook up the inputs for pitch and gate and that sort of thing, and the audio outputs. So Polymode is a little unique in that sense because you don't really have to hook anything up to the CV inputs. Polymode is programmed under the hood to automatically connect the poly pitch, poly gate, and poly velocity. So instead of hooking up cables, you don't need to hook up anything to the inputs. As you can see, I'm playing it and everything just works as if the cables were connected. The nice thing is if you want to hook up something else to these inputs, you can just route a cable however you like in voltage, and the normal connections will be overridden. You might have also noticed these little green boxes with arrows, and these are to visually indicate the normal connections. You can see that the green color over here matches the green color of the boxes. Incidentally, we also normaled the CV source's bend jack to the bend input over here, and again you can see there's a little color-coded box that matches up here. You also might have noticed that I didn't run a cable from the mix output to the main output up here. And the reason for that is a little different. This connection is not normaled. However, I did use the Voltage 2 cable bus feature just so we wouldn't have to look at a cable strewn across here through the whole demo. With regard to signal flow, the original Polymoog isn't really a left-to-right affair, and neither is Polymode. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm going to start with the oscillators, which are called ranks in Polymoog speak. And as you can see, there are two of them, and they're both pretty much identical other than the fine-tuning control on rank number 2. Now in the original Polymoog, rank 1 only did a ramp wave, and rank 2 only did pulse waves. So this was a sort of annoying limitation. And on top of that, the way the controls were arranged was super duper confusing. So we just threw that all out the window and did a much more conventional design that would be much easier to use, and it doesn't sacrifice any functionality over the original. In fact, it gives you more functionality because you get ramp wave and pulse wave for each oscillator. Now, before we delve into the individual controls, I'm going to talk about this guy over here, which is the rank mix slider. This is really, really simple. This is just a balance control for oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, and in the middle it's 50%. So you can hear, that's the first one, you can hear the pulse wave. You can hear them mixed together now, half and half. And then we fade over to rank 2, which is a ramp wave. So I'm going to push this all the way up to 1, and now we're only hearing rank 1. And let's go over the controls. I'm going to take the decay down a little bit. First we have footage, which is just an octave setting, and I'm going to hit the same key. And next we have the waveform controls. Right now it's on a pulse wave. I can turn that off, turn on the ramp wave. And I can put on the pulse wave, or I can combine them. And over here we have the modulation and shape controls. FM refers to frequency modulation, and that's going to be used for vibrato. I can bring up the amount and the rate. And notice that the amount, even when it's fully cranked, isn't really that deep. And that's how a real Polymoog works. The modulation doesn't go crazy deep on it. It's not something you can use to make sirens. But the nice thing is it keeps it pretty musical. So it's real easy to accurately dial in very musical vibrato. Moving on, we have the shape mod, and that's Moog terminology for pulse wave, pulse width, and pulse width modulation. So I'm going to switch to the pulse wave. I'm going to turn off the frequency modulation so you can hear it a little better. And now if I turn it down to 5%, we get a really skinny pulse wave. And if I turn it up to 50, you get a full square wave. These controls right here are for pulse width modulation. And at this point, I should probably explain one really unique feature of the Polymoog, which is that the LFOs are all independent. On a standard analog synth, you usually have 1 or 2 LFOs, and then you have some sort of modulation routing matrix where you route where it goes. But on a Polymoog, all of the LFOs are dedicated. So in other words, when I was fooling with the frequency modulation over here, this uses a dedicated triangle wave LFO, and then the pulse width modulation, these two controls over here, have another dedicated triangle wave LFO. That may not sound like a big deal, but it's part of what really makes the Polymoog unique. On just about any other classic analog synth, you can't adjust the pulse width modulation speed and depth independent of the pitch modulation and depth. And that's the key to what gives the Polymoog its unique kind of warble sound. And it's really the sound of Vox Humana, the famous Gary Newman sound. And there it is. At the bottom of the screen, we have CV inputs for all of the controls. And I'm going to take a mini LFO over here. I'm going to put it on the shape of the pulse. And these have a lot of range. In the center, they're at 0, so no modulation. And moving clockwise from center, we get positive modulation. Moving counterclockwise, we get negative modulation. Rank 2 is identical to rank 1, except that it has a fine-tune control to detune it against rank 1. So I'm going to move the rank mix to an equal mix between them. And you can hear I can detune the oscillators. This is pretty standard, but I do want to point out that we built in a lot of resolution around 0, so it's really easy to get very fine tunings between them. And then as you get out towards the extremes of the control, it gets much more coarse, going up or down to a fifth in either direction. A minute ago I was talking about how the frequency and pulse modulation have their own independent dedicated LFOs, and it's the same for oscillator number 2. So you've got a total of 4 LFOs between these guys. So you're able to create some pretty complex modulations just using the frequency modulation and pulse width modulation of each oscillator. Let me show you. So here's where Polymoog voice architecture gets a little weird. In just about every analog synth on the planet, you would typically have oscillators, then the voltage-controlled filter, then a voltage-controlled amplifier, which was being controlled by an amplitude envelope, and so forth, and then on to the output. But in a Polymoog, it's kind of backwards. The oscillators are first, and then it goes to the voltage-controlled amplifier. So I'm going to talk about the amplifier section, and this is a pretty simple 3-stage affair. So first we have the attack knob, and this goes up to 7 seconds like a real Polymoog. And then we have a sustain level over here, so when it reaches the top of the attack envelope, it sustains at whatever level you've got set here. And then we've got this decay release slider. Now what's unique about this are 2 things. Well, first of all, it works the same whether you hold down a key or not. And second of all, it goes insanely long, to 36 seconds. Okay, I'm just going to sit here while it releases. You might want to get a beverage or catch up on a TV show or something. Nah, I'm not going to let it go. But on a real Polymoog, it's really that long. Ours is a little different because ours actually decays to silence. In a real Polymoog, it sort of decays to some wash of every note playing at once really quietly in the background. It's not a feature you would enjoy, so we decided not to do that. Real Polymoogs have another weird quirk about them, that the attack time cannot be longer than the decay time, which can be a real drag, and it just starts acting really funny if you do that. So we didn't think anyone would want that. Finally, over here we have a velocity slider, and this works in conjunction with the polyvelocity over here, which is invisibly connected, so I don't need to have that cable. And the velocity amount slider works kind of backwards from a lot of synths. If you have it at 0, that's maximum velocity sensitivity. So if I hit it real light or hard, you'll have maximum velocity at 0. And as you turn it up, it has less sensitivity. If you turn it up all the way, it's at full blast no matter how hard you hit the key. Moving along with Polymoog and Polymode's unique voice architecture, after the voltage-controlled amplifier, the signal is malted to Polymode's 3 filters. Now, one of these filters is a conventional VCF with frequency and emphasis, which is resonance. The other 2 filters are quite unique. One of the sections is what they call Resonators, which I'll get into in a minute. And the other section is called the mode filters, which are these presets here. And I'll get into those in a moment as well. So as I mentioned, these are connected in parallel. They're not in any particular order per se. You just hear them in varying amounts depending on their level over here in the master gain mixer. So I'm going to bring up the VCF slider over here. And it sounds like a standard voltage-controlled filter. And if I turn up the emphasis, that's the same as resonance. Over here we've got this KB. It stands for keyboard. As you play up the keyboard, it'll get brighter and brighter. So that's got keyboard tracking control. And over here we have a voltage-controlled filter envelope, and that can be used to control the cutoff. So I'm going to bring down the cutoff amount. And this is pretty simple. The more amount I bring in, the more it controls the cutoff frequency. Now, the one caveat of the filter is it is a paraphonic filter. And what that means is it is just one filter for every single key on the keyboard. So the thing you need to know about that is if you're using a quick percussive kind of envelope like this, if I'm holding down a key and I hit another key, it affects every key all at once. So that can be kind of a disadvantage if you're trying to make guitar or piano sounds or that kind of thing, because everything keeps re-triggering. However, it's really good for this one trick. I'm holding down a chord with my right hand, and I'm playing really fast with my left hand. So jumping back to our VCF section, I want to cover this mod section. And here we have yet another triangle wave LFO. If I bring up the amount, get our standard kind of wah-wah effects. And there's also a sample and hold, which is a random wave. And this is controlled by the same LFO. These guys share an LFO, so you can hear if I bring up the triangle wave, it's at the same speed as the sample and hold. So you may want to take notice of the fact that between the oscillators and the filter mod, we are now up to 5 independent triangle wave LFOs. The next filter section I want to talk about is the Resonators section. Its name implies that it's some kind of fixed filter bank, which was pretty common in Moog Modular synthesizers of the 70s. But in fact, it's not at all. What it really is in the real Polymoog is 3 12 dB per octave state variable filters. And what's unique about the implementation is, unlike most filters, each one has a limited range. You can see 60 Hz to 300 Hz is the low range, 300 Hz to 1.5 kilohertz is the medium range, and 1.5 kilohertz to 7.5 kilohertz is the high range. So I haven't really ever seen a filter with a limited cutoff frequency range, but here it is. So what you could do with that is you can make these sort of vocal resonances by cranking up the emphasis, which is resonance, and messing with the cutoff. And you have 3 separate peaks. So let's bring up the resonators over here in the master gain mixer. You can see the controls are the same for each of the 3 bands. It has a cutoff frequency control for each one. It has an emphasis slider, which is resonance. And it has a gain knob, which is just the volume for each section. So you can hypothetically turn off sections if you want by turning the gain down to nothing. And then up here we have this pass mode control over here. And this lets you select low pass filter, band pass filter, or high pass filter. And then we've got this slope control over here. Now in the original, it was 12 dB only, but in Polymode, we actually have a 24 dB mode too. And when I demonstrate this, you'll see why we added this. It adds a much more intense character. So let's start in 12 dB mode. And I'm going to start in band pass mode. And let me turn these all down. And let's bring up the middle one. And crank up the resonance or emphasis. And as I move this, you can hear it sounds a lot like a phaser. And if I bring in the high band, these really interact against each other, so you get all this kind of phasey weirdness. And let's bring in the low one. You're probably thinking to yourself, this is screaming for modulation because, moving this up and down is going to get old real quick. In the original Polymoog, there was no way to modulate these. And honestly, it was a total bummer because it sounds so cool when you move these against each other. But as you can see in Polymode, full CV control. So it's really easy to hook up LFOs to these and modulate them. I'm not going to do it in this video because this video is already going to be like 73 minutes long, but I'm sure it's easy to imagine what this would sound like with an LFO. Now I've been demonstrating this in bandpass mode, but you can also put this in low pass. Or high pass. So that all sounds great, but it doesn't really sound like a voltage-controlled filter opening and closing. It sounds phasey. So this is why we added the 24 dB slope. With the 24 dB slope, these really sound like real filters. How cool is that? Let me put it in bandpass mode. Oh, loud. And high pass mode. So this Resonators thing is just boatloads of fun. And as you'll see later, it gets even cooler because you get cancellations and phasing between the filters, and it's just all kinds of madness. The last set of filters are the mode filters. Now in a real Polymoog, these buttons correspond to sound presets that change all of the controls. But each one of the sound presets has its own filter dedicated to that preset. And these aren't really standard filters in the sense that they don't have cutoff controls or voltage control capabilities. They're just fixed filters with no user controls. Think of them as kind of like a preset graphic EQ for each one of the presets. So what we did was we modeled each one of those filters so you can have that sound and bring that in on a slider over here, much like the regular Polymoog. So in order to demonstrate them, I'm just going to set up a really simple sawtooth wave with no modulation. So here's the string, piano, organ, harpsichord, funk, clav, vibes, brass, and the infamous Vox Humana. So on their own, they don't really sound mind-blowingly impressive, but combining them with the voltage-controlled filter and the resonators makes all sorts of colors, and it's really easy to just flick through them and see which one sounds cool. I should mention that it's really important to understand that the mode filters in Polymode just refer to these fixed preset filters. Pressing these buttons does not bring up full sound presets. And the reason why we implemented it this way is because obviously Voltage has its own very extensive, deep preset browser, and we thought it would be really confusing to have presets on top of presets, so we just went ahead and used these for the filters only. So all three filters get combined over here in the master gain section, and this is just a mixer, and you've probably noticed this DIR slider here, and that stands for direct. And that's just an unfiltered signal, so it's rank 1 and rank 2 combined with the rank mix slider over here. And imagine that just going over here to this direct slider. So if I bring this up, that's no filter. And it's good for adding a little brightness to sounds, and also it sort of gets out of phase with the other faders as well. So I'm going to bring up the mode filters and the VCF. Here's my VCF. It's a little quieter right now. And I can combine that with the direct and my resonator. And it's really neat the way these interact. I'm going to pop through some of the mode filters. Now you can get a lot of different colors by combining these different sliders. And when you're playing a real Polymoog, all you think about the whole time is, man, I wish I could modulate this. So of course, with Polymode, we've added CV controls for every one of these sliders, so it's super easy to modulate these. From the master gain section, the signal jumps all the way down here to the output section. The mix output over here is just a mix output of everything from the master gain section, and we've got a master volume over there. And then we have individual outs over here for each one of the sections, and that opens up all sorts of possibilities for external processing, routing, panning with mixers, all kinds of fun stuff. Over here we have a basic master tune control, up down a half step, and a pitch bend control, and this goes anywhere from 0 to all the way up to an octave. And as mentioned, this is a normal connection, so we don't really need a patch cable here. And if I have this cranked up all the way to an octave, the pitch bender will go up and down an entire octave.